Margaret Thatcher has that speech in Bruges and gave it the same importance even that this group that is founded after that single speech ascribes to it. The last time I recall meeting Lady Thatcher was at an event where the inestimable Connor Burns had invited a number of members of the new intake to meet Lady Thatcher. And I was privileged to talk to her with Connor and Rory Stewart, MP for Penrith and the Border. And Lady Thatcher was on fine form, and I remember the conversation. She was berating Rory Stewart on the subject of his backbone. And this was a time when I think Connor and I were about to vote for something relating to Europe, or more to our opposition to the European Union, where she was very approving of our voting plans, but less so those of Rory. And I don't think she knew that he had his role in governing a Iraqi province or walking across Afghanistan, and certainly not his giving birth to his own child last week. But she then turned her attention onto me and Connor, where I think the previous week there'd been a great dinner of the Taxpayers Alliance, and Taxpayers Alliances from around the world. And Lady Thatcher had come to a small private drinks beforehand, and the main guest speaker after the dinner was Arthur Laffer, he of the Laffer curve. Now, myself and Connor were both under the impression that Arthur Laffer was some professor from sometime in the post-war period, and had this great economic insight of his Laffer curve, where you get zero tax at a 0% rate, and then it goes up, but then it goes back down when you get to 100% tax rate, so I'm sure most of you know. But we said to Lady Thatcher we had assumed he was dead, or if not dead, perhaps a professor in his sort of 90s, a very old man, sort of waving a stick, perhaps. And Lady Thatcher then berated us, and she and Ronnie had followed this chap's work, but at the dinner he was a dashing man with sort of jet black hair and a very, very impressive, incredibly energetic sort of person. And she simply laughed at myself and Connor for how we could possibly have thought he was dead, or even an old man waving a stick in his 90s. And then I shan't attempt to impersonate Margaret Thatcher impersonating Arthur Laffer, but she then started waving her arm around in the air as if she was a man in his 90s needing the support of a stick. And Connor and I would put very much in our place, along with Rory, before the great Lady Thatcher, who you have founded this group in memory of what she said at Bruges. The specifics of what she said at Bruges, I think that phrase that I introduced my speech with resonates so much with me, and I wonder if it resonates with you for the same reason. I think it was partly because Lady Thatcher was saying Europe is not the EU, or at that time the European Community, and that these countries were still behind the Iron Curtain. They were not part of the European Community, and the European Community could not purport to represent or to be Europe. And I think many of us would and do strongly agree with that sentiment. I think that there was also another implication, at least, of what Lady Thatcher was saying, in that those countries would have a right to join the European Community, and were they to do so, it would be very difficult to see the European Community integrating in the federal direction, integrating on, and I would say the model set out by Maastricht, but of course John Major's great claim about Maastricht was you had this sort of pillar structure, but actually that's now disappeared, and we're back to that tree structure of the initial Dutch draft. And we had just, I think, two or 3 years before the Bruges speech, the European Community had expanded to take in Spain and Portugal. And I think even at that point there was perhaps a bit of disappointment that expansion hadn't slowed the momentum towards European integration, although that possibly wasn't completely clear. And there were still hopes that expanding the community, and as we know it took in Sweden and Finland and Austria in 1995, but certainly if it were ever to take in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, then that would be a block to it becoming this federal state, of which the member states were mere subsidiaries, and that those two visions were not compatible. What I think is interesting is those hopes have not come to pass. And 25 years on, we find that the admission of those countries from Central and Eastern Europe have not in any way halted or even slowed the momentum towards European integration. And I mean, in explaining why that is, I think, we took 15 years to actually admit these countries, so they had changed and developed to quite a degree before that admission happened. Second, some of the Western European countries that were in the European community have stopped growing. So while in 1988, when Margaret Thatcher spoke at Bruges, we would have seen that the countries of Poland or Czechoslovakia, as it then was, as being so far behind countries of Greece, Portugal, Italy. Actually, since then, Italy and Portugal at least are basically the same size economies they were then. Growth has stopped. And rather than the European community generating great expansion in those countries, we a short-lived boom, certainly in Spain and Portugal, after the introduction of the euro. But since then, there has been such a collapse that, at least in respect to Portugal and Italy, there has been virtually no growth over that whole period. So there is a greater commonality, at least economically, between the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and those of Southern Europe. We also, as all of us in this hall will be so familiar with, the structures of the European Union, as set up by Monnet and Schuman and others, were designed as a motor to drive integration without democratic consent. And I don't think we underestimate the strength of those forces. And the strength of those forces pulled the countries of Central and Eastern Europe into their orbit and integrated and dominated them to the same degree that had happened to other countries before them. And they failed to act as a brake in the way that we had hoped. I also think there is something quite specific about the countries of Central and Eastern Europe in terms of average wage levels. And this is true to an extent to some countries in Southern Europe, but if you focus on average wage levels in the public sector, they are an awful lot lower across the countries of Central and Eastern Europe than they are elsewhere in the European Union. And for those politicians and bureaucrats and people around them who are driving European integration are the people who are the agents of the European Union in their own countries. The gap between the salaries let alone expenses and other and remuneration of other types that they might have between working for the European Union and the bodies around it and being simply in their own country in a middling public service role are so enormous that the incentive to the ruling class, the elites in those countries, of that European process is absolutely enormous. And I think perhaps for those of us whose view of politics is more driven perhaps by ideology, I think we underestimated perhaps the extent to which those financial incentives would work in countries with lower average wages in the public sector. So I'm now a UKIP MP. I'm no longer a Conservative MP. And one very big reason I made that switch is I decided that the Prime Minister David Cameron was not serious about European reform. I, like Douglas Carswell, like many others, was impressed by what he said in his Bloomberg speech only in January last year. But what we have seen since has been a letdown. And the moment for me, I think if I can pick one moment, which is always difficult, was a meeting of the 1922 Committee of Conservative Backbenchers in June this year, shortly after the Newark by-election. And I remember one of my then colleagues, John Barron, the MP for Basildon and Billericay, he asked the Prime Minister, what are we going to renegotiate? What are the powers we will get back? And before his usual waffle on that subject, the Prime Minister said that if he was to get back all the powers some people were asking for, it would almost become like associate membership, as if that was self-evidently a bad thing, rather than not just what I think almost everyone in this room would want, But actually the vast majority of those Conservative MPs and people out in the country would like a trade-only relationship where we trade with Europe but govern ourselves. And I think that is something that is on offer. I think even the strongest of pro-EU federalists within the European system, I think would be willing to give to Britain an associate membership, a privileged partnership, something which allowed them to continue their desired drive towards European Union without our always sort of carping from the sidelines and trying fairly ineffectively to slow them down. But what's become clear, at least to me, is that the Prime Minister is not serious. He doesn't want to negotiate that. We have a whole series of relationships between the EU and countries around or within it, in the case of Switzerland, speaking geographically. Turkey has a customs union. Norway and Iceland, and one or two very small countries, are in the EEA. And the UK is such a large country. We are the largest market for the European Union, the largest market for Germany. They sell more to us, I think, than to the United States and Japan put together, that I think we would inevitably have a bespoke arrangement that was appropriate for them and appropriate for us, rather than an off-the-shelf model that someone else had negotiated. And I think the benefits of continuing that free trade relationship would be so great, particularly to them, as they sell so much more to us than we do to them, that I think we could get something better than for example, Switzerland. It's observed Switzerland still has freedom of movement, at least if that referendum result isn't respected, and we will see what happens there. But I think for the United Kingdom, I think it would be perfectly reasonable to get a relationship outside the European Union, but where we had a privileged partnership with it, including with a measure of control which we would require in our country over freedom of movement. But the Prime Minister is not willing to negotiate that. He is not willing to negotiate anything that is outside the current structures of the European Union. The basis of his approach is that whatever his supposed renegotiation, it will be on the EU treaties as they are, with the UK as a full participant within those treaties, within the European institutions, and within the acquis communautaire. And I think that is terribly sad, because I think there is scope for this country to negotiate something that is much better. But I think we now need to understand that that will be something which is outside the European Union. And the main reason that is the case is because it's not realistic to expect all the countries of the European Union to change how they relate to each other in order to suit how they relate to the United Kingdom. So where the UK can, on a bilateral basis, negotiate things with the EU, we cannot expect to change the institutional relationship between Germany and France or Italy or Poland. That ultimately is something about which they have extremely and understandably very strong views, and don't want those connections between their countries to be determined by the particular issues of the UK debate. So for me, the renegotiation that David Cameron promises is a facade. It is a device. And the purpose of that renegotiation is to help him win a referendum where at one moment of time he gets a small amount, at least over 50.01% of the population, to vote to stay within the European Union. But of course that's not the question he will put to them. He will tell them that he has renegotiated the European Union, that it's all going to be very different in future, and all these problems we may criticise about. It's going to be a new David Cameron negotiated future relationship with the European Union, where because of his extraordinary diplomatic skills and political finesse, he will have got the other countries in the European Union to address our major concerns and promise that for the future things will be different and that we will be happier and able to live within the European Union. And for a short period around that referendum campaign, those other European leaders will go along with it. They will make political statements. They may even sign things, but they will not change the underlying treaties of the European Union, which determine their own relations with each other and the drive towards ever closer union in Europe, whatever the words may be of the politicians at that time. But the words of the politicians at that point in time, with most of the Conservative Party, the leadership of the Conservative Party, almost all the Labour Party, the whole of the Liberal Democrats, with all of them arguing that, oh, this is different and on this renegotiated basis we should stay in, it's in our interests, when actually the decision is just do we stay in the EU as it is or do we leave and negotiate something else, that will be a tilted playing field. We have seen with Scotland how important the terms and nature of a referendum are. And whatever I may say against David Cameron with respect to the European Union, we at least had David Cameron, as our Prime Minister, as leader of the United Kingdom, negotiating for us, for the Union side of that referendum, as to what the terms of that Scottish referendum would be. Now, I don't think he did a very good job of it, but we did at least have a negotiation between David Cameron and Alex Salmond and their intermediaries about the basis on which that referendum would take place. If David Cameron and the Conservatives were to win the next election, which I think is an incredibly unlikely eventuality, and when people question me or question UKIP, it seems to be on this assumption that if it were not for us, there would be this great popular Conservative Party that would be sort of moving towards victory at the next election. I see no serious prospect of that. But what would be happening within that referendum, if David Cameron were re-elected, is he and the team to which he gives patronage around him will determine everything about how that referendum takes place. There won't be anyone negotiating with him, and he has said he will use that referendum. His role in the referendum is to use it to keep Britain within the European Union. And if we are to have a once-in-a-generation, the first since 1975, vote on whether we will be an independent country or whether we want to remain part of this European Union, I want to have that on free and fair terms. And in particular, I want a referendum which is clearly between our membership of the European Union, as we have grown to know it, and as in reality it will remain in any event, and leaving. I would like, if possible, there to be greater clarity about what leaving means. That we would have free trade with the European Union under Article 50, a 2-year negotiation process. If actually that process had taken place and we knew what the alternative actually was, that would be the single best situation in which to have a referendum. But if we are to decide, it should be a straight, fair, in-out referendum, not the loaded device tilted towards his objective of keeping us in the European Union that David Cameron would wish.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.